Good afternoon. Being faithful to God often means facing great challenges. And that's what we see in the life of King Hezekiah, whom we're looking at this week. Earlier in my sermon and in Monday's devotion, I talked about how Hezekiah turned to the Lord when his kingdom was threatened by the mighty army of the Assyrian Empire. So then, when the Assyrian threat was removed, you would think that life would improve for King Hezekiah, but this poor guy simply couldn't catch a break. Not long after this military threat against his kingdom had been removed, Hezekiah became ill. In fact, he was on his death's bed. The prophet Isaiah gave him a message from the Lord that he should put his affairs in order because he was going to die. And Hezekiah's immediate response, once again, was to turn to the Lord. This is a constant we see in his life. It's practically a reflex reaction that Hezekiah had to bad news. And here we find a poignant image from Hezekiah's life. This is a scene that I think really made him my favorite king. Hezekiah, laying on his sickbed, turned his face to the wall. Maybe he did this so other people couldn't see. Maybe he did it because he wanted to be alone in private with God. Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and prayed and wept. And God honored that prayer and those tears. So he sent Isaiah back to the king with a second message. This time, the Lord's message to Hezekiah was, I will add 15 years to your life. You're not going to die after all because of your tears and your prayer. And, the Lord told Hezekiah, I will continue to protect your kingdom from the Assyrian Empire. When Hezekiah heard this news, he asked for, and the Lord provided, a sign to guarantee this promise. This reminds me a bit about the sign that the Lord gave to Noah after the flood. He said, the rainbow in the sky will be a sign that never again will I destroy the world with water. This time, Hezekiah was asking for a sign, not for himself, but for the Lord's glory. What he asked was, what will be the sign that I will go up to the temple of the Lord? In other words, what is the sign, God, that I will be able to continue to worship you? Because that was what mattered for Hezekiah. And so the Lord provided with him a sign. He said, the shadow in the stairwell is going to go backwards 10 steps. And it did. Now, we don't know if it's because the sun reversed its course, or because God somehow miraculously bent the light that was going to the stairs, or if there's some other way that God provided the sign. The only thing matters is that God did provide this sign and this assurance to Hezekiah that his prayers had been heard, his tears had been seen, and that God would spare his life. After Hezekiah recovered from his illness, he wrote a psalm or a poem to express himself, and we find this in Isaiah chapter 38. Here he recounts how hard his life had been, but then he offers a keen insight. Hezekiah prayed, Lord, by such things, that is, by all these difficulties I faced, Lord, by such things people live, and my spirit finds life in them too. You restored me to health and let me live. Surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish. Once again, appearances are deceiving. It seems odd for us even to think about what Hezekiah is talking about. How can we find life in anguish and heartache and struggle and grief and loss? How can it be for our benefit when we experience the kinds of things that Hezekiah did? How can it be that we live through these sorts of things? Perhaps we find a hint of an answer in what Hezekiah wrote next. He recognized the Lord's love for him by the way he saved him. Hezekiah wrote, "You put all my sins behind your back." In other words, the Lord hid my sins. Lord, you do away with my sins. And without Hezekiah's afflictions, he would not be able to experience God's grace and power. In this poem or prayer of Hezekiah, he reframes what it means to face afflictions and difficulties. Our afflictions are more than just hurdles that we must get through. First, do not minimize the afflictions in your life. Don't pretend that they don't really matter. Hezekiah sure didn't. Consider how he reacted to his struggles. When he heard about the Assyrian army, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and turned to the Lord in the temple. And then, when he was ill, perhaps the most powerful image of all was when he turned his face to the wall to pray and to cry. No, Hezekiah was not a man for whom anguish was merely theoretical. He lived it, he experienced it. But affliction is more than just something we seek God to save us from. Although it certainly is that. We do seek for God to save us from affliction, but it's more than that. Affliction is an opportunity to see God at work in our lives. It is when we are afflicted, it is when we are distressed, it is when we face problems that we can recognize how God's love is at work in our lives, when he removes our sin and when he restores our health. Would you pray with me, please? Lord, once again, we thank you for the witness of King Hezekiah, for the way in which he turned in faith to you during his illness, but also for the insight that you gave to him that he shares with us through his prayer that we find in the book of Isaiah, that it is in our afflictions that we find life, because it is through them that we can discover how you are at work in our lives. So give us hearts that are open to recognizing how you are at work, so we truly can give you our praise. Amen. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again later.